In the quiet unfolding of European history, grain has always been there. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats. The simple harvest of the fields, measured, weighed, and sold, year after year. For more than a century, the price of grain was recorded, counted carefully, and compared, as if the numbers themselves carried meaning beyond their columns. This is the story of those prices. It is not dramatic. It is not filled with battles or kings. It is only the calm, steady pulse of the harvest, spoken without emotion, as one might read an old ledger before sleep. If we begin in the year 1920, we find a continent that was tired. The war had ended, though the echoes still lingered in the villages and the cities. The land, however, did not rest. Wheat still grew, rye still grew, barley bent in the wind, and the people counted the bushels. They weighed them, and they wrote down the numbers. Grain, at that time, carried the price of hunger and the price of survival. A loaf of bread could mean more than gold, and yet, when we look back, all we see are numbers, steady, shifting, small differences from one year to the next. Imagine then the record of wheat in France, a price that moved up when harvests were thin and moved down when barns were full. Each fluctuation a simple matter of rain or of drought or of a sudden frost. There were no speeches to mark these changes, no celebrations, just a quiet adjustment. Farmers taking note, millers counting coins, bakers adjusting the size of a loaf, and then another year and another note in the ledger. As the 1920s carried on, prices rose, not in leaps but in gradual steps. In Germany, the shadow of inflation made everything uncertain, and grain was no exception. A loaf of bread might double or triple or vanish into absurdity as paper currency lost its weight. Yet still, behind the storm of numbers, the actual harvest continued in its patient rhythm. The wheat grew, the rye grew, the barley grew. No matter how the currency faltered, the fields remained steady, waiting to be cut, threshed, and weighed. We may picture, if we like, the markets of Poland, where sacks of grain shifted slowly across wooden carts. Farmers spoke little, their hands rough, their eyes tired. The buyers counted, not hurried, not frantic, simply counting, again and again, knowing that grain was more certain than the coins they exchanged. The ledgers filled with figures, higher one year, lower the next, nothing more than numbers, but numbers that carried the slow heart of daily life. By 1925, prices had settled into a pattern. France recorded wheat at a level that was modest, neither soaring nor collapsing. The people bought their bread, baked it, and ate it with the same steady calm that history often forgets. These are not the dramatic stories we usually hear, but they are the true weight of life. Grain, year after year, priced and sold, silent and constant. Through the late 1920s, harvests were kind in some places and thin in others. In Spain, the dryness of summer raised the cost of rye. In Italy, barley remained steady. In Northern Europe, oats grew in quiet abundance, their price hardly shifting at all. Across the continent, the story was not of sudden change, but of gentle fluctuation, the kind that goes unnoticed, except by those who must record it. Then came the turn of the decade, and with it, the Great Depression. Grain prices, once holding their line, began to slide. From 1930 onward, the downward drift was unmistakable. Wheat lost value, rye lost value, barley, too, declined. The ledgers, once neat with steady numbers, now showed a slow unraveling. Farmers, felt it most of all. Their fields still gave, but the market gave less in return. The crops grew as they always did, yet the price they fetched could no longer keep pace. In Germany, the fall of wheat prices was marked by quiet despair. In rural France, barley was harvested as before, but its worth diminished with each passing season. The numbers tell the story without drama. One year, a slight drop; another year, a further slide. Over 5 years, the value of grain nearly halved. Not suddenly, not with shouts or alarm, just slowly, predictably, as though time itself had chosen to lessen the worth of the harvest. By 1935, the continent had grown accustomed to these new levels. Farmers adjusted, selling more for less, living thinner lives, but continuing nonetheless. Bread remained on the table, though perhaps in smaller loaves, perhaps baked with more rye than wheat. The price of grain was low, but it was still counted, still recorded. The ledgers did not stop. And then, as the 1930s drew to a close, the world shifted again. War loomed. But even before its first shots, the prices of grain began to stir. Wheat edged upward, cautiously; rye followed; barley and oats joined, slowly, like reluctant companions. This was not yet scarcity, not yet rationing. It was only the anticipation, written in numbers, of what was to come. The calm record of these years does not tremble, even though we know what history held. It simply lists the harvest and the price, and the next harvest, and the next price. Quietly, patiently, without emotion, a rhythm as steady as sleep. By the year 1939, the continent was already uneasy, yet the grain still grew. Wheat rose in the fields of France, rye bent in the winds of Poland. Barley and oats swayed in the northern plains, and, as always, the numbers were written, a bushel here, a sack there, recorded with the same plain ink as before. The difference now was the shadow that moved across Europe. War would change the meaning of grain. When the first months of conflict arrived, the market prices told the story slowly. They climbed, not suddenly, but with a steady persistence. Wheat, once modest, crept higher. Rye followed the same path. The ledgers grew heavier, the numbers a little larger, year after year. Farmers noticed it, of course. Bakers noticed it. Families noticed it. But the fields themselves remained unchanged. A stalk of wheat bowed its head the same way it always had. The oats rustled in the same calm winds. Nature did not rush, even though men did. In Britain, the war brought rationing. Bread was counted, slices measured, flour carefully divided. The price of grain was not only a matter of coins now, but of policy and control. Numbers shifted less freely, restrained by the hand of governments. Yet the old truth remained. The wheat was planted, the barley sprouted, the rye endured. Its worth was written down, quietly, though fewer eyes could see it. In Germany, grain became part of the machine of war. Prices were managed, sometimes hidden, but always there, in the background. Farmers harvested as before, though much of their crop was taken not to market, but to the state. Still, behind every requisition, there was a figure. Behind every loaf, a price, and behind each year, a slow record of decline or rise, written with the same dry strokes of the pen. Across occupied Europe, the numbers varied. In some places, scarcity pushed the value higher. In others, control pressed the value down. But always, the story was one of quiet necessity. Grain was needed. Grain was consumed. Grain was counted. And after it was eaten, the ledgers turned to the next line, the next season, the next calculation. The 1940s carried on this way. Each year, the fields offered what they could, and each year, the markets adjusted, even if the markets were only shadows of their old selves. A farmer in France might note that his wheat fetched less than he hoped, though it still fed mouths. A miller in Belgium might record the rye he received, the number hardly worth mentioning, but written down nonetheless. These quiet details filled the years, unnoticed by the noise of war, yet steady as the passing of days. By 1945, the war ended. Europe was weary once more, its fields scarred but still fertile. Grain prices, as though mirroring the relief of peace, shifted. Again, at first they climbed, as shortages lingered. Bread was precious. Barley was measured. Oats were counted with unusual care. The numbers were higher, yes, but they were also uncertain in France. Wheat fetched a price that was almost double what it had been before the war. In Germany, the numbers were tangled, caught in the confusion of currencies and reform. Yet the record remained calm. One year, a rise. Another year, a small dip. No leaps, no collapses. Just the same quiet rhythm that had always guided the harvest as the late 1940s unfolded. Grain prices began to stabilize. Slowly, they found their balance. Wheat settled into a moderate range. Rye, too, leveled. Barley and oats followed, their values aligning with the steady demand of daily bread and simple meals. By 1950, the continent had regained its breath. The fields looked much as they had before the war. Wheat bending in the wind, rye standing tall, oats stretching in quiet rows. The numbers written in ledgers looked similar too. Not the same, perhaps, but familiar. Each harvest had its price. Each price told its story. And the people, once again, baked their bread, measured their slices, and lived their quiet lives beneath the same old rhythm. Through it all, there was no drama in the record. Only numbers, slow to rise, slow to fall. One century unfolding in small, measured steps, the prices of grain carrying with them the hidden weight of life itself. By the year 1950, Europe had settled, at least in part, into a rhythm of rebuilding. The war was over, the scars still visible, but the fields did not linger on wounds. They returned, as they always had, to the steady work of growing. Wheat stretched across the plains of France. Rye stood in neat rows across Germany. Barley spread across the British Isles. Oats lingered in the cooler soils of Scandinavia. Each stalk, each harvest, a quiet continuation of what had always been. And once again, prices were written down. 1950 showed wheat at a modest figure, not too high, not too low, as if Europe itself was tired of extremes. Rye was much the same, holding a level that neither burdened the baker nor rewarded the farmer with great fortune. Barley and oats followed the same calm path. The ledgers of these years are not exciting. They are slow, steady, repetitive. A number this year, a number slightly different the next, and then another after that. In Britain, the system of rationing lingered until the early 1950s. Bread remained measured, slices weighed carefully, flour balanced by policy, yet the price of grain still shifted quietly in the background. A farmer received a fair return, not rich, not poor, and the records showed it. By 1954, rationing ended, and the market resumed its familiar rhythm. Bread was baked more freely again, though the numbers behind it did not rush or surge. They simply crept, year by year, into their place. Across France, wheat prices in the 50s were noted as stable. There were small changes, a rise in a dry year, a dip when rains were good, but never a great disruption. The farmers knew what to expect, the millers knew what to pay, and the bakers knew what they would receive. The loaves that appeared on tables across the country carried the quiet continuity of this balance. Germany, divided and rebuilding, still kept its ledgers. In the West, wheat and rye returned to predictable levels by the mid-50s. In the East, where different rules applied, the figures were recorded with less freedom, but they too showed stability. A bushel of barley might be worth a set amount, unchanged across seasons, yet still written as carefully as if it were the result of free trade. Numbers, slow, steady, indifferent to the politics that surrounded them. Italy, Spain, and the southern lands of Europe experienced the same quiet trend. The 1950s, in grain, were not dramatic years. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats all moved gently, like waves that rise and fall without storm. A dry summer in Spain might bring a slight increase in rye. A wet harvest in Italy might lower the price of barley. But the changes were small, calm, and quickly absorbed into the steady movement of the decade. By 1955, the figures showed only modest shifts. Wheat across Western Europe was priced at a level that made bread affordable but did not enrich the farmer. Rye remained dependable, barley much the same. Oats, less central, still carried their value, measured quietly in corners of the ledgers. The decade continued, year after year, without sudden turns. The late 1950s brought with them the beginnings of modernization. New machinery entered the fields. Tractors replaced horses more fully. Fertilizers were used more widely. Yet, even with these changes, the numbers and the ledgers remained calm. A farmer might harvest more, but the market adjusted. Prices did not leap. They simply adjusted downward when supply was high, upward when supply was low, always in small, gentle measures. By 1960, Europe had entered a new phase. Recovery was complete in many places. Cities had grown, industries hummed, but the fields continued their same rhythm. Wheat was harvested, priced, and written down. Rye followed. Barley and oats completed the set. The numbers of 1960 looked much like the numbers of 1950, though written in a new decade. The early 1960s were no different. Wheat in France showed a slight increase. Barley in Britain held steady. Rye in Germany drifted down by a small margin. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just the same careful records, year after year. And so, the 1950s and early 60s may seem unimportant. Yet they are part of the quiet century of grain. They show how, after war and turmoil, the price of bread, the value of barley, the worth of rye, all returned to balance. The numbers speak not of triumph or collapse, but of calm, of continuity, of the endless patience of the fields. By the middle of the 1960s, the European continent was no longer in recovery, but in growth. Factories produced, cities expanded, highways stretched outward, and homes filled with the sounds of modern life. But in the fields, the cycle was unchanged. Wheat still bowed in long rows beneath the summer sun. Rye still grew in the soil, waiting to be cut and bundled. Barley continued to lie heavy in its husks, and oats remained the quiet crop of northern lands. Grain moved forward, as it always had, season after season, without care for the cities that grew beside it. The numbers that measured it moved too quietly, with little flourish. A bushel of wheat carried a slightly higher figure than it had a few years earlier, though the increase was hardly dramatic. Rye followed the same path. A step upward here, a small pause there, its worth as consistent as the bread it created. Barley, used for both bread and beer, carried its own steady importance. Never valued too highly, never valued too little, just enough to matter. Oats, less essential to urban diets, held a modest place, rarely shifting far. And yet, when these prices were written, when they were listed in ledgers across Europe, they spoke of continuity more than change, of the patient rhythm that had already lasted centuries. As the 1960s drew to a close, the story of grain became quietly linked to the story of politics. Europe was preparing to integrate its markets more fully, and with that integration came new rules for how food was valued. In 1962, the Common Agricultural Policy was introduced in the European Economic Community. At first, it was just another policy, another framework, another slow movement of bureaucracy. But behind its quiet words was a clear effect. The price of wheat, of rye, of barley, and of oats was now guided not only by the rain and the soil, but also by decisions made in offices and parliaments. The ledgers of the late 1960s revealed this influence in their calm numbers. Wheat was kept at a stable figure, gently supported so that farmers would not suffer sharp losses. Rye too was cushioned, its value maintained so that no one region fell into despair. Barley and oats, smaller in the larger picture, found themselves carried along by the same system. The result was that the fluctuations of harvest years, once sharp and personal, became softened, regulated, managed. Yet still, to the listener or the reader of these numbers, nothing appeared dramatic. The prices remained calm, steady, and predictable. A year ended, the harvest was counted, and the figures were written. Then another year ended, and another figure followed. Nothing more but the 1970s would change the tone, even if slowly, even if only in the quiet march of numbers on a page. The early part of the decade, from 1970 to 1972, appeared calm enough. Grain prices, like the decade before, moved within narrow bounds. Wheat rose only slightly. Rye showed little movement. Barley and oats drifted along, steady and unremarkable. But then came 1973. The world outside the fields grew unsettled. Energy prices surged. Oil became costly. Transportation, storage, and the machinery that worked the land all felt the burden. And grain, as simple as it seemed, could not escape the pull of those forces. In that year, the ledgers shifted. The numbers that had remained modest, controlled, and predictable began to climb. Wheat rose first, its value jumping higher than farmers had seen in a generation. Rye followed soon after, and barley too. Oats, usually quiet, rose with them, pulled upward by the broader tide. For those who watched, it was unusual. For those who lived it, it was not dramatic but steady, a change that felt heavy and real. Even if the ledgers recorded it without emotion, the mid-1970s carried this rise forward. By 1975, wheat prices across much of Western Europe were nearly twice what they had been at the beginning of the decade. Rye too was elevated, its worth suddenly significant after years of quiet. Barley fetched more coins, oats as well, and the farmers who had once accepted low margins now found their crops valued more. But these changes, while important, were still recorded in the same slow hand. A page from 1974 lists the new figures in the same way a page from 1954 once did. There is no sense of drama in the writing, no alarm, no exclamation, only a line, a number, a quiet record. Wheat is worth this much. Rye is worth this much. Barley and oats are worth this much. And then the page turns. Another year, another record, another quiet addition to the endless chain. By the late 1970s, the situation had shifted again. The shock of higher prices began to calm. Wheat leveled, rye followed, barley adjusted, oats found their way back to steadiness. It was not a return to the modest numbers of the 50s, but neither was it the sharp rise of 73. Instead, it was a plateau, a quiet balance reached after the storm. A farmer harvesting in 1978 might note that his wheat brought a decent price, not too low, not impossibly high, simply enough to mark a season as worthwhile. A baker might find that flour cost a little more than before, but not so much that bread could not be baked as always. The ledgers show this calm. Numbers neither falling nor climbing quickly, but resting, steady and patient, as if the fields themselves had settled into the new order of things. And so the 1970s ended not with disruption, but with a kind of quiet certainty. The grain continued to grow, the prices continued to be written. Each stalk of wheat was counted, each sack of rye weighed, each bushel of barley marked, each measure of oats placed into the record. The world had shifted around them, economies had risen and faltered, policies had guided and controlled, but the rhythm of the harvest was unbroken. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Year after year, price after price, ledger after ledger, the same. Calm story, moving forward with the slowness of time, carrying Europe into the next decade. By the time 1980 arrived, Europe had entered a new kind of rhythm. The farms were no longer struggling to recover from war, nor were they straining under the shocks of the 1970s. Instead, they had become modern, efficient, and in some ways, too productive. The tractors were larger now, their engines steady and dependable. Fertilizers and chemicals were applied with careful precision, ensuring that the fields gave more than they once did. Wheat stretched taller, fuller, and denser than in the days of hand-tilling. Rye spread in heavy patches, barley thickened across the lowlands, and oats, though less central, filled their quiet share of the soil. The effect of all this was simple. The barns were fuller than they had ever been before. And when barns are full, the ledgers take note. Prices in the early 1980s began not with a rise, but with a soft decline. Wheat, which had fetched a respectable figure at the close of the 70s, eased downward by a small but noticeable step. Rye did the same. Barley followed. Oats, as always, drifted quietly, neither high nor low, simply less than before. There was no panic, no sudden collapse, only the calm, slow truth that when supply outweighs demand, the numbers bend toward the lower side. It was during these years that the phrase grain mountains began to appear in quiet reports. Europe, under its common agricultural policy, had supported its farmers so thoroughly that harvests exceeded consumption year after year. Surpluses were stored away in silos, in warehouses, in government reserves. Butter mountains and wine lakes became metaphors, but grain was perhaps the most enduring of them all. A mountain of wheat is not dramatic to the eye, for it is hidden away, stored carefully, sealed and silent. But in the ledgers, its presence is clear. The numbers of price reflected this abundance. Wheat was worth less in 1983 than it had been in 1981. Rye drifted gently downward to barley showed the same story, a quiet ease, a lowering. Yet to the ear, to the listener in the night, it is only the same rhythm as always. Another year, another figure, another small shift recorded without emotion. In France, the breadbasket of Europe, wheat was harvested in abundance. Farmers brought in more than markets could consume, and the state ensured that their efforts were not wasted, buying the surplus and storing it. The price they received was steady, not generous, but stable, a reflection of policy rather than pure demand. Across Germany, rye followed a similar path. Its worth was maintained by the frameworks that governed agriculture, so that even when too much was grown, the price did not collapse entirely. In Britain, barley was plentiful, filling both food and brewing needs, yet here too, abundance kept the figures modest. Oats remained in the background, filling their quiet niche, never commanding headlines, but always written in the same careful strokes across ledgers and reports. The mid-1980s continued this trend. By 1985, surpluses had grown so large that warehouses across the continent were filled. The policymakers responded with interventions, buying grain, storing grain, sometimes even disposing of grain. And yet, the prices on the page barely moved. Wheat remained low but steady. Rye remained low but steady. Barley remained low but steady. Oats, as ever, remained low but steady. The farmers did not prosper, but they did not starve. The bakers found flour affordable. The consumers found bread accessible. And the system, though heavy, held together. To read the figures of those years is to read monotony. 1984. Wheat at this price, rye at that price, barley at a figure only slightly different, oats hardly changing at all. 1985. The same, perhaps a fraction lower, perhaps unchanged. And so it went, by the later years of the decade. Small adjustments began to appear. Policies shifted, seeking balance, attempting to reduce the endless surpluses. Incentives were created to limit production, to let land rest, to ease the steady build-up of grain mountains. The figures responded slowly, with no rush. Wheat edged upward slightly in 1988, rye followed a year later, barley adjusted in quiet fashion. These were not dramatic increases. They were merely corrections, careful and deliberate, written into the ledgers as calmly as every other line before them. And when 1990 finally arrived, the story of the 1980s was clear. It was not a story of hunger, nor of dramatic fortune. It was a story of excess, of surpluses too large, of barns too full, and yet, in the record, it appears only as a gentle decline, a leveling, and then a small return. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats. Their prices began the decade higher, fell during its middle, and settled toward its end. Each line written without emotion, each year passing without drama. The harvests grew, the barns filled, the ledgers recorded, and the century of grain prices continued its slow march, carrying with it the same patient rhythm that had always defined it. When the calendar turned to 1990, Europe entered a decade of change, though the fields themselves remained familiar and steady. Wheat still grew in the same places. It had grown for centuries. Rye still pressed upward in the soil of Germany and Eastern Europe. Barley continued to bend beneath the northern winds, and oats stretched across cooler climates, quietly filling their place. Yet outside the fields, decisions were being made in offices, in ministries, and in the halls of the European community. These decisions carried weight, not through sudden shocks, but through the slow and deliberate guidance of prices, supports, and reforms. The decade began with an awareness that the surpluses of the 1980s could not continue forever. And so, little by little, policies shifted to create balance. But the ledgers of the early 90s record these shifts in the same calm hand as always. Wheat, in 1990, held a figure only slightly higher than the year before. Rye moved by the smallest of margins. Barley remained steady. Oats continued quietly in the background. The words of reform and change sounded in speeches, but in the fields and in the ledgers, the rhythm remained as patient and slow as sleep. In the early part of the decade, around 1992, the reforms were introduced, a restructuring of the Common Agricultural Policy. These reforms reduced the guaranteed support prices for many crops, including grain, and instead offered direct payments to farmers. The effect on the numbers was not dramatic in a single year, but steady across several. Wheat prices eased downward, not collapsing, but lowering gently, as if exhaling after decades of being held high. Rye followed the same pattern, adjusted slowly, gradually reduced from its former levels. Barley, too, shifted in this quiet way, a small decline in 1 year, another small decline the next, until by the mid-90s the figures looked distinctly lower than before. Oats, being less central, hardly drew notice, but their prices too softened, reflecting the same quiet trend. None of this was violent or sudden. The ledgers simply show the calm correction of policy, the careful balancing of abundance, the steady recalibration of numbers that had been written too high for too long. In France, wheat remained the central crop, its prices recorded in detail, its movements noted with care. Farmers adjusted to the new system, receiving less through the market, more through direct payments. Yet in the ledgers, the entries were still the same. Wheat at this figure in 1993, wheat at a slightly lower figure in 1994, wheat at another modest figure in 1995. Germany's rye prices followed a parallel course, the reduction clear when read across the years, yet never dramatic enough to disturb the calm of the record. In Britain, barley remained important, especially for brewing, but even here, the figures reflected the broader pattern of quiet decline, supported not by surges of demand, but by the policies that steadied the system. Oats continued, understated, as ever, with their numbers drifting downward, marked only as another small line in another quiet ledger. The mid-1990s reinforced this slow adjustment. By 1996, wheat prices across much of Western Europe had reached a new level, lower than in the late 80s, yet stable enough to provide certainty. Rye, barley, and oats stood alongside it, all softened, all steady, all modest. The reforms had done their work, not in a dramatic instant, but in a slow, deliberate movement, carried out over the span of years. For those reading the figures, the effect was clear, but calm. The numbers of 1992 were higher than those of 1996, but each year between them tells the same slow story, a small decline, a careful shift, a gentle correction, like a gradual slope rather than a sudden drop, toward the end of the decade. As 1998 and 1999 passed into view, the system had settled. Wheat carried its new, modest value. Rye was measured at a level that reflected both policy and market. Barley remained predictable. Oats continued quietly. There were no shocks, no collapses, no leaps. The century was nearing its end, but the rhythm was unchanged. Grain was grown, harvested, measured, and recorded. Its price was written, adjusted slightly, and then written again. The ledgers of the 1990s may speak of reform, but to the ear, they tell the same story as always. Slow numbers, steady patterns, calm figures that pass without drama. And so the 1990s closed, not with disruption, but with balance. The fields looked the same as they always had. Wheat bowed in the wind. Rye stood tall in rows. Barley filled the barns. Oats lingered quietly, unassuming but present. The numbers that described them were steady, slightly lower than before, carefully adjusted, patiently recorded. Another decade had passed, another quiet addition to the long chain of years. Another page in the endless ledger of European grain prices. When the century turned in the year 2000, the fields did not notice. Wheat continued its quiet sway. In the wind, rye stood upright in the same soils it had always known. Barley filled the northern plains, and oats lingered in the margins. Less celebrated, but still present. Farmers planted, harvested, and measured, just as their fathers had done. Just as their fathers' fathers had done before them. Yet, outside the stillness of the fields, the world was widening. The European Union was preparing for its largest enlargement, welcoming new members from Central and Eastern Europe. With them came new acres of farmland, new farmers, new ledgers filled with figures of wheat, rye, barley, and oats. The prices of the early 2000s reflected this slow expansion. Wheat in Western Europe remained steady, supported by policy, but the inclusion of new producers pressed the system toward adjustment. Rye, once the bread of the East, entered the records of the wider Union, its price modest but steady. Barley and oats came along too, their values written down with the same patient calm as ever. To the listener, to the one following the story. By voice in the night, it is the same tale as always. Grain prices listed year by year, a little higher here, a little lower there. Never rushing, never dramatic, simply moving as time moves. The early part of the decade was calm. Between 2000 and 2004, wheat prices drifted within narrow ranges. Sometimes up by a fraction, sometimes down by a fraction, as if the numbers were reluctant to show any excitement at the turn of the millennium. Rye followed the same narrow line, barley too, oats as well. But when 2004 arrived, and with it the enlargement of the Union to include Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and others, the story widened. These were lands with deep traditions of grain, places where wheat and rye had been measured for centuries. Their entry added new figures to the ledgers, more lines, more records, more prices to be harmonized. At first, the numbers were uneven, different across regions, but policies worked to align them, to bring the eastern fields into rhythm with the west. And slowly, steadily, the ledgers grew uniform. Wheat across Europe was worth this much. Rye across Europe was worth that much. Barley and oats too found their place in this quiet unification. It was in the later 2000s that the calm rhythm began to shift. Between 2006 and 2007, harvests across the world tightened and demand pressed harder. Suddenly, grain was no longer only a matter of European fields and policies, but of global flows, of ships crossing oceans, of markets linking continents. Wheat prices began to rise, not quickly at first, but enough to be noticed in the figures. Rye followed, barley to oats as well. all lifted by the same tide. By 2007, the ledgers show a sharp step upward, unusual after decades of calm. The following year, 2008, the step became more than a step. Wheat prices surged, reaching levels not seen in a generation. Rye too grew expensive, barley and oats followed. For farmers, it was a season of relief, their crops suddenly valued higher than before. For bakers and consumers, it was a season of strain, as bread carried a heavier cost. But even here, the ledgers tell the story without emotion. 2007, wheat at this higher figure, rye at another, barley lifted, oats lifted. 2008, higher still, just numbers, carefully written, without drama, without flourish, without voice. When the financial crisis came in 2008 and 2009, grain prices too felt the pull. The sharp rise was followed by a decline, not into collapse, but into correction. Wheat eased downward, rye followed, barley and oats to return to more modest levels. By 2009, the ledgers showed figures lower than in 2008, but still above the calm ranges of the early decade. It was a new balance, a reminder that the world was now more connected, that grain prices in Europe were not only shaped by rain and soil, but also by distant markets, energy costs, and trade. Yet to the record, the story is still quiet. 2009 is simply written as another line. Wheat at this, rye at that. Barley and oats recorded as always. And so the 2000s ended with prices higher than they had been at the beginning of the decade, but not so high as to break the rhythm. Wheat remained essential, rye remained steady, barley remained useful, oats remained modest. The European Union had grown, the global market had pressed in, volatility had shown its first signs, but in the end, the ledgers looked the same as they always had. Another year, another number, another line added to the quiet chain of history. Another step in the long, unhurried march of grain prices across a century. When the decade of the 2010s began, the fields of Europe looked no different than before. Wheat continued to bend under the slow weight of the summer air. Rye stood quietly in the soils of Central Europe. Barley ripened in the northern lowlands, and oats still lingered, filling their modest role. Farmers planted, farmers harvested, farmers sold, and clerks recorded. The new decade promised nothing unusual at first. Wheat prices in 2010 sat at a level not far from the balance reached at the end of the previous decade. Rye, too, held to its place. Barley followed. Oats drifted quietly alongside. But outside the ledgers, the world was shifting. Droughts in distant countries tightened global supply. Demand pressed harder, not only for bread, but also for livestock, feed, and energy alternatives. And so, once again, the numbers in Europe began to rise. Wheat crept upward, rye followed in its path, barley to oats as well. In 2010, the lines of the ledger grew slightly taller. In 2011, they rose further still, climbing toward levels that recalled the surges of the late 2000s. The year 2011 stands out in the record, though the ink tells it as plainly as any other year. Wheat reached a figure that tested families who bought bread each day. Rye, in its modest way, became more costly than it had been in many seasons. Barley followed oats too, no longer overlooked but carried upward by the same tide. There was no sudden alarm in the ledgers themselves, no sign of stress in the way the numbers were written. They appear calm, even when they reflect the tension of the time. A line for wheat, higher than last year. A line for rye, higher again. Barley and oats, higher too. Then the clerk turns the page, and the story continues, without pause, without urgency, without voice. After the surge of 2011, the figures settled somewhat, though not into the quiet stability of the earlier decades. Wheat remained higher than in the early 2000s, rye too, barley as well, oats modestly so. The middle years of the decade showed this balance. 2012, 2013, 2014, all marked by figures that did not return to the low calm of the past, but did not climb to impossible heights either. Instead, they hovered in the middle, reminding the reader that the age of volatility had begun, that the world outside the fields had grown entangled with the value of grain, and yet, still, the ledgers record them plainly. 1 year, wheat at this number, the next year, wheat at another, rye, barley, oats, all following their quiet course, each written without embellishment, without interpretation. By the later part of the decade, the fluctuations grew more noticeable again. In 2015, prices drifted downward, wheat easing lower, rye softening too, barley and oats following quietly. In 2016, the figures held modestly. Then, in 2017 and 2018, drought touched the harvests of Europe itself, tightening supply, reducing yield, and pressing the numbers higher. Wheat rose again, rye rose, barley rose, oats as well. These shifts were not sudden shocks, but steady steps, the sort that feel large to those who live them, yet appear calm when written in the long list of years. The ledgers show them, as always, 1 year lower, the next year higher, the pattern unfolding with the same slow rhythm as sleep. As the decade drew to its close, in 2019, prices settled once more, not at the lows of the early decade, not at the highs of the surging years, but in the middle, where stability felt possible though never certain. Wheat carried its modest figure, rye too, barley steady, oats continuing as always. The record shows the numbers plainly. Wheat is worth this much. Rye is worth that much. Barley and oats are worth their own figures. The clerk turns the page, the decade ends, and the century of grain prices prepares for its next chapter. And so, the 2010s can be remembered not as calm like the 1950s, nor as abundant like the 1980s, but as unsettled, shifting and shaped by global pressures. Yet in the ledgers, in the calm lines of ink, it is the same as every other decade. A figure for each crop, a record for each year, a page turned, a new line written. The rhythm continues, slow, steady, endless wheat, rye, barley, oats. Another decade, another measure, another quiet entry in the long history of European grain prices. The year 2020 began like any other in the long line of years before it. Wheat was planted across the plains of France, rye in the soils of Poland and Germany, barley in the north, oats scattered more modestly in cooler lands. Farmers worked their fields, seasons followed their course, and ledgers prepared to record another set of familiar figures. But as the year unfolded, the world beyond the fields grew unsettled. A pandemic slowed the movement of people, slowed the movement of goods, and pressed upon the patterns of trade that had once seemed unshakable. For grain, the harvest itself was steady, the wheat still grew, the rye still ripened, the barley and oats continued their quiet work, but the prices reflected the uncertainty of the wider world. Wheat held firm in the early months, then edged upward, not because the fields gave less, but because the movement of what was harvested grew more fragile. Rye followed, barley to oats as well. The ledgers of 2020 show these modest adjustments, written without comment, written without alarm. One figure for wheat, a little higher than the year before. One figure for rye, the same. Barley and oats, noted carefully, modestly. Another line in the long account. The following year, 2021, continued in the same unsettled way. The harvests were ordinary, some regions good, some regions less so, but the markets responded to the memory of fragility. Wheat prices rose again, rye too, barley and oats along with them. Farmers welcomed the higher returns, bakers adjusted, consumers noticed the weight in their daily bread. Yet the ledgers remain flat and calm. The ink does not hurry, does not bend to drama. It simply notes the numbers. Wheat at this price, rye at that, barley and oats at their own. For the historian, the figures speak of strain. For the listener at night, they are only another set of calm words, drifting like the repetition of a lullaby. In 2022, the world shifted again. Conflict returned to Europe, unsettling trade, disrupting supply chains, and pressing grain markets into tension. Wheat rose sharply, higher than in many years before, its figure stretching tall in the records of the time. Rye followed, its modest place suddenly significant. Barley too grew costly, oats as well, no longer quiet, but touched by the same wave. For those who lived the year, the changes were heavy, urgent, undeniable. But in the ledgers, in the calm, writing of price and harvest, the story appears, as it always has. Wheat is written at this figure, rye at that, barley here, oats there. Another year, another set of lines, another quiet addition to the chain. No alarms, no exclamations, no urgency, just numbers, plain and still, telling of a world unsettled but doing so without voice. The later years of the decade have yet to be fully written, yet the pattern has already revealed itself. Volatility has become familiar, not as rare disruption, but as part of the rhythm itself. 2023 showed prices that eased downward from the sharp highs, yet still stood taller than in decades past. 2024, in some regions, continued the same. Wheat carried its value, rye held higher than before, barley adjusted slightly lower, oats steadied quietly. Each figure was written as it always had been, line after line, page after page. The changes may feel significant in the living, but in the recording they remain calm. A year's figure entered, the page turned. The next year awaited, and so the 2020s unfold. Not yet finished, not yet complete, but already marked by disruption and uncertainty. Yet even with pandemic, with conflict, with shifting trade, the story of grain remains the same. Wheat planted, rye grown, barley ripened, oats harvested, each crop measured, each value recorded, each number written plainly. The century-long rhythm does not break, it only absorbs, smoothing every surge and every fall into the same quiet cadence. Another year, another price, another line, another entry in the endless, monotonous ledger of European grain. When one begins to look back across the century of grain prices, from the early 1920s to the years of the 2020s, the first impression is not of sudden shocks or dramatic upheavals, but of a long and steady rhythm, measured in pages of ledgers and rows of figures. Wheat is there at every step, written more often and more prominently than any other, the constant presence of the European field. Rye, less celebrated but deeply important, appears beside it year after year in the soil of Central Europe, in the bread of daily life, its value fluctuating but never disappearing. Barley, steady in its role, written for brewing and for feed, marked each season as if to remind the record keeper that not all grain goes to bread. And oats, quieter than the others, remain faint but consistent, appearing on every page, never absent even if overlooked. Together, these four grains trace the passing of a century, their figures rising, their figures falling, yet always written in the same careful hand, 1 year at a time. If one compares the early decades with the later ones, the differences become clear. In the 1920s and 30s, grain prices reflected a Europe rebuilding after war, then slipping into depression, then preparing for another conflict. Wheat was low in the years of oversupply, rye carried less value, barley and oats were modest. The ledgers of those years tell of markets struggling to stabilize, of farmers recording numbers that often disappointed, of figures that dipped and faltered. Then came the 1940s, a decade of scarcity and control, where prices meant little without availability, and yet the records still show numbers, carefully noted, even when grain itself was rationed and scarce. By the 50s, the story shifted to rebuilding, to steady growth, to numbers that held higher, more balanced, more reliable. The 60s and 70s brought expansion, new policies, and the rise of a system that promised stability, and the ledgers reflect this promise with figures that sit comfortably, neither too high nor too low, a rhythm of reassurance. The 80s, with their surpluses, tell a different kind of story. Grain prices fell, not because of failure, but because of plenty. Wheat was abundant, rye too, barley and oats filled the barns, and the market responded with lower figures, year after year, recorded without excitement, as if to remind the reader that abundance can be as unsettling as scarcity. Then came the reforms of the 90s, lowering prices gently, shifting support from markets to direct payments, smoothing the numbers so that the ledgers of those years appear calm and deliberate. Each figure a little lower than the last, but all written steadily. By the 2000s, the calm began to break, not because Europe changed in itself, but because the world pressed harder on its markets. Global demand, global supply, global trade all reached into the European fields, and the ledgers began to record volatility. Prices rose, prices fell, prices rose again, all more sharply than in earlier decades, and yet the ink remained calm, the handwriting unchanged, the rhythm steady even as the numbers themselves grew restless. The 2010s confirmed this new rhythm of volatility. Wheat rose sharply in some years, fell back in others. Rye followed, barley and oats did the same. Drought in Europe, drought abroad, global crises, shifting trade, all entered the story, but only through the plainness of recorded numbers. There is no voice in the ledger that tells of struggle or relief, no tone to say this year was difficult, that year was better. There is only the figure itself, rising, falling, steady, changing. By the 2020s, disruption was clear again. A pandemic slowing the world, a conflict straining supply, uncertainty spreading through markets. Prices surged, then corrected, but always the record remained the same. Wheat at this value, rye at that, barley at another, oats at their modest level. A century had passed, but the way it was written remained unchanged, line after line, number after number, unbroken in its monotony. What this century reveals is not a story of drama, but a story of endurance. The crops do not disappear. The prices never stop being recorded. The rhythm never halts. Wheat sways in the wind as it did 100 years ago. Rye stands tall in the same soil. Barley ripens under the same skies. Oats grow quietly in the margins. Farmers plant, farmers harvest, clerks record. Wars may pass, reforms may come, crises may rise, abundance may return, scarcity may strike, but the structure holds, the ledger remains. Each year receives its number, each number its place, each place a part of the whole. And when one reads across the century, from the early 1920s to the 2020s, what one hears is not a story of emotion or urgency, but a story of repetition, of calm, of unbroken continuity, where the passing of time is measured, not by words or by voices, but by the slow and patient entry of numbers into the record. And so, the century of European grain prices can be read as one long, uninterrupted lullaby. It is a song without melody, a history without drama, a story without climax. It begins with wheat, rye, barley, and oats in the 1920s. It ends with wheat, rye, barley, and oats in the 2020s. Between them lie figures written plainly, decade by decade, year by year. Nothing ends, nothing begins anew. The rhythm is constant. The prices change, but the act of recording them does not. And as the listener drifts into sleep, the story closes, not with resolution, but with continuation. For the next year, too, will be written, and the year after that, and the century after this one, until all that remains is the endless calm of numbers, the quiet roll of history, and the steady hum of grain across the fields of Europe. When one reads through the century of grain prices, it is easy to imagine them as isolated figures, detached from the world, standing alone in their ledgers like marks upon a page that have no life beyond their ink. Yet in truth, each of those numbers found its way into daily life through something so ordinary that it is rarely remembered as history at all. The price of wheat became the price of bread, and the price of bread became the measure of daily living. Year after year, decade after decade, a small rise in the cost of wheat meant that the loaf on the table weighed more heavily in the purse, and a decline meant it was a little easier to buy. Rye did the same, though less visibly, for in Central Europe the bread was darker, denser, and made from rye that was as essential as wheat was elsewhere. The ledgers never mention bread, yet bread is what they recorded, silently, indirectly, page after page, as wheat and rye were valued, sold, and consumed. The century of grain prices is therefore also a century of bread, each figure an echo of loaves baked and eaten, each adjustment in the ledger a shadow of flour sifted, kneaded, and placed into ovens that burned day and night across Europe. Barley tells another story, quieter in its place, but no less constant. For while some barley went into bread, much of it travelled instead into vats and barrels, to be boiled, brewed, and stored as beer. The prices of barley, recorded as modest or strong, stable or shifting, were reflected not in the flour of the miller, but in the casks of the brewer, in the mugs of alehouses, in the glasses on tables where men and women gathered. The ledger speaks only of barley at this price or that, yet behind each number there are countless mugs raised, countless conversations held, countless hours of quiet consumption that link daily life to the market. And when barley prices rose, the cost of beer rose too, perhaps only slightly, perhaps enough to be noticed, but always directly tied to the figure in the clerk's book. Thus, The long century of grain prices is not only a story of food but also of drink, where the ink that marked barley's worth marked at the same time the worth of something poured into countless cups across a continent. Oats, humbler still, entered daily life in ways that rarely found themselves in the central records of culture. But they remained steady companions of the century nonetheless. Where wheat made bread and barley made beer, oats became porridge, became feed, became the quiet filler of bowls and troughs. They were cheaper, they were less celebrated, yet they carried their own quiet necessity. When oat prices rose, it meant something subtle. The morning meal of porridge was slightly dearer, the cost of feeding horses or livestock a little higher. When they fell, the relief was equally modest, but present nonetheless. No one celebrated the fluctuations of oats, no one built policy around their value, and yet the clerks still wrote them down, year after year, century without pause. In their quiet way, oats remind the reader that history does not always move through grandeur, that sometimes the small, modest grain sustains as much as the celebrated ones, and that every figure, no matter how small, tells of lives lived quietly around them. Together, these grains, wheat in bread, barley in beer, oats in porridge, rye in darker loaves, carried Europe across the century. And yet the ledgers never mention bread or beer or porridge or loaves. They never mention meals or tables, bakers or brewers, households or families. They mention only numbers. A figure here, a figure there. Wheat this year, rye next year, barley and oats written below. But when read carefully, one sees that the numbers are never abstract. They are always tied to life, always tied to daily rhythm. Each rise meant fewer loaves for the poor. Each fall meant more mugs filled with ale. Each balance meant the same steady bowl of porridge upon a table. Thus, the story of the century is not only a story of markets, but of sustenance, not only of ledgers, but of kitchens, not only of numbers, but of meals. Yet told, as it is here, with no emotion, no urgency, no embellishment, it remains flat, steady, monotonous. Another recitation of figures that smooths the real lives they touched into the same endless cadence. And in this way, the century of European grain prices can be read as a story that is both deeply human and strangely distant. To the farmer, the price of wheat was livelihood. To the baker, the price of flour was business. To the brewer, the cost of barley was production. To the family, the cost of bread was survival. To the child, the price of oats was porridge at dawn. Yet to the ledger, these were only lines of ink, written year after year, without commentary, without explanation, without care for the lives behind them. Bread, beer, porridge, loaves, mugs, bowls, all dissolve into wheat, barley, rye, oats, and the numbers attached to them. What was once hot in the oven, frothing in the cask, steaming in the bowl, becomes flat in the record, reduced to price alone, stripped of smell, stripped of taste, stripped of urgency. And it is in this reduction that the true monotony of history for sleep is revealed, that a century of meals can be told only as a century of numbers, repeated in steady cadence until the listener drifts into quiet rest. Across the century of European grain prices, one constant figure remains, though rarely mentioned in the ledgers themselves. It is the farmer, standing behind the field, guiding the plough, watching the sky, sowing the seed, reaping the harvest. For each number recorded, there was a farmer whose hands placed the seed into the ground, whose tools worked the soil, whose care sustained the crop until it was cut and carried. And yet, the ledger does not name them. It does not record their hours or their fatigue, their hopes or their doubts. It records only the outcome. Wheat at this price, rye at that, barley here, oats there. The entire weight of labor, of sweat, of seasons endured is pressed into a single line of ink, silent, unadorned, indifferent. One can imagine fields stretching across France, Germany, Poland, Spain, the Balkans, each filled with farmers at work, but the record does not speak of them. It reduces all of them into the simple fact of a figure written at the close of a season. In the 1920s, the farmers who tended these fields worked largely by hand or with horse and plough, with tools that had changed little from the century before. They bent their backs to the earth. They sowed with measured steps. They harvested with sickles and scythes, or with early machines that rattled and strained. Their lives were close to the soil, their work heavy, their dependence on weather complete. Yet when one looks to the record of those years, nothing of this appears. The droughts, the rains, the blights, the lean years, the good years, all vanish into the price. Wheat falls, rye declines, barley holds steady, oats slip a little lower. That is all that remains. Behind each figure were thousands upon thousands of farmers, and yet the monotone history reduces them into a single value, as if all the complexity of their existence could be written in a single stroke of ink. By the middle decades of the century, machines grew more common, tractors moved into fields, combines cut swathes where once scythes had been needed. Farmers worked differently, with more power at their hands, yet still bound to the same rhythm of season and soil. A bad year was still a bad year, a good year still a good year, and the price remained the measure that defined them. Wheat rose, rye steadied, barley dipped, oats moved with little notice. Each entry in the ledger was both an abstract figure and the concrete result of countless lives lived in work. Farmers planted, waited, harvested, sold, and the market gave them their return. But the ledger does not tell of satisfaction or disappointment. It does not tell of the relief of a successful harvest, the despair of a failed one. It writes only the figure, calm, detached, distant. The story of their labor is reduced to monotony. The human voice flattened into the mechanical repetition of numbers. As the century progressed further, farms grew larger, techniques modernized, fertilizers and chemicals changed the yield. Policies altered the flow of subsidies and supports. Farmers found themselves not only tending crops, but navigating systems of regulation, of quotas, of payments. Yet the result, again, was the same. At the close of each season, grain was sold, the price recorded, the figure written: wheat, rye, barley, oats. Year after year, decade after decade, the same words, the same categories, the same quiet notation. And for the farmer, who might have experienced triumph or struggle, change or continuity, the ledger remained silent. It did not see the family that carried the farm across generations, the debts taken on, the investments made, the fields lost or gained. It saw only price. A century of farming collapsed into a century of figures, written calmly, monotonously, without the trace of the people who gave them meaning. And so, when one looks back across the 100 years of grain prices, one sees not the farmers themselves, but only their shadow, stretched thin across the page. They are everywhere, and yet they are nowhere. Every figure is their work, and yet none of their work is described. Every line of ink is drawn from their labor, and yet their labor is invisible. The farmer plants wheat, the ledger writes a number. The farmer grows rye, the ledger writes another number. The farmer tends barley, the ledger does the same. The farmer cuts oats, the ledger closes the account. In this way, an entire century of lives is transformed into monotony, the endless hum of prices rising and falling, until what remains is not the story of people but the story of numbers alone. And in this monotone telling, the listener is carried not into urgency but into calm, not into drama but into rest, until the sound of farming across 100 years becomes only the sound of quiet repetition, steady, lulling, unending. When one looks at a century of grain prices, the lines of ink in the ledger seem calm and self-contained, as if they were drawn from nowhere, created without effort, detached from soil and sky. Yet behind every figure lies the long patience of seasons, the turning of winter to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn back into winter again, repeated without pause, year after year, decade after decade, until the full century has passed. The numbers that appear in ledgers, wheat valued here, rye noted there, barley recorded, oats listed in their place, are nothing more than the final echo of what the seasons allowed. A wet spring meant seed was sown late, and a late sowing meant harvest came later, yields lower, prices higher. A dry summer scorched the fields, withered the stalks, reduced the weight of the grain, pushed prices higher still. A year of balanced weather, steady rains, gentle warmth, even harvests, left the ledgers calm, figures steady, prices modest. But no matter what the sky brought, the record remained unchanged in its form. It wrote only numbers, not storms. It wrote only values, not droughts. It wrote only results, not causes. Thus, the seasons, so vivid to the farmer, so present in the field, are almost invisible in the history that survives. They live only in the quiet rise and fall of figures, translated from the language of clouds and rain into the language of ledgers and ink. Across the century, Europe knew all forms of weather, from the bitter winters of the early 1920s, when snow lay heavy across the fields and froze the soil deep, to the long, dry summers of later decades, when rain failed to come and crops bent under unrelenting sun. Storms swept across plains and valleys, flattening wheat, drowning rye, leaving barley and oats broken in the mud. Yet when the clerks closed their books at year's end, they wrote without reference to these events. They did not note the frost that killed seedlings, nor the hail that struck in June, nor the floods that washed across fields in late August. They did not describe the worry of the farmer who looked at a sky that would not rain, or who watched too much rain fall when it was not needed. They wrote instead, wheat at this number, rye at that, barley a little higher, oats a little lower. The sky itself, vast and uncontrollable, becomes invisible in the calm monotony of prices. And yet, if one reads carefully, if one traces the peaks and troughs, one can hear the faint echo of storms and seasons behind the figures. A sharp rise whispers of drought. A sharp fall suggests abundance. A steady price speaks of balanced weather. In this way, the century of skies is folded silently into the century of ink. The farmers knew the seasons intimately, for they lived within them, measured their days by them, carried their hopes in them. To the farmer, the winter was preparation. The spring was work, the summer was vigilance, the autumn was harvest, the cycle unending. A frost was not a line in a ledger, but a ruined field. A drought was not a figure, but an empty granary. A generous season was not a statistic, but bread on the table and grain in the barn. Yet history, as it is written here, smooths these realities away. It takes the cold of winter, the heat of summer, the winds of autumn, the rains of spring, and reduces them to a shift of a few numbers. The century of weather, with all its variety, its endless unpredictability, its vastness becomes calm in the record, flattened into the monotone rise and fall of prices. The storms rage, the rains fall, the snow melts, the sun burns, but the ledger remains the same, a place where the complexity of sky and season is translated into the quiet, steady hum of figures, and thus, when one reads across the 100 years, one is not reading only the history of markets, but the shadow of a century of weather. Each decade carried its droughts and floods, its generous years and lean years, its storms and calms, and each of these entered the record indirectly, stripped of their force, softened into numbers. The farmer may have remembered the summer of scorching sun, the winter of deep frost, the autumn when rains would not stop, the spring when fields could not be sown. The family may have remembered the bread that cost too much, the grain that was too little, the porridge made thin. But the ledger did not remember these things. It remembered only wheat at this price, rye at that, barley here, oats there. And so, the vast and living drama of the seasons, the full weight of a century of skies, becomes another quiet thread in the monotone story, another pattern in the unbroken fabric of repetition, until all storms and all calms are forgotten, and only the slow lull of prices remains. When we follow the story of 100 years of European grain prices, it is easy to think only of the field, the farmer, the harvest, and the market where grain was sold. But behind the field and beyond the market, there were governments, parliaments, ministries, and councils, all watching grain closely, all shaping its flow in ways that were often invisible to the simple figures in the ledger. In the early years of the century, when markets were still recovering from war, policies tried to steady supplies, to ensure bread remained affordable, to balance the needs of urban workers with the struggles of rural farmers. Governments taxed, governments subsidized, governments stored reserves, governments opened or closed borders to imports. And yet, when the year ended and the record was written, none of these debates appeared. The ledger gave no account of the speeches made in parliaments, the meetings in council halls, the arguments between city leaders and rural representatives. It gave no account of quotas set or subsidies granted. It wrote only what had always been written: wheat at this number, rye at that, barley recorded, oats marked quietly in their place. Policy, however heated in its making, dissolved into the calm monotony of prices. Across the mid-century decades, as Europe changed, rebuilt, divided, and rejoined, governments became more active in grain than ever before. Some nations set minimum prices to protect farmers, others purchased harvests directly. Still others imported grain from abroad when harvests were poor. The European Union, in its growth, created common agricultural policies designed to balance fairness with productivity, to stabilize prices across borders, to ensure that farmers had security and consumers had supply. Subsidies flowed, tariffs were raised or lowered, quotas enforced, reserves maintained. For the farmer, this meant some relief, some certainty. For the consumer, this meant more predictable bread, more stable costs. Yet when one looks at the record of the time, the complexity of these systems, the layers of regulation, the bureaucracy and decisions vanish entirely. The ledger notes only the final result: wheat slightly higher, rye unchanged, barley steady, oats in decline. A century of government debate is folded into the calm, flat rhythm of figures that tell everything and nothing at once. And it was not only Europe's own governments that shaped the numbers. Grain flowed across oceans, and so policies in distant lands, in America, in Canada, in Russia, in Ukraine, carried influence as well. Trade agreements signed in quiet offices, export restrictions declared in moments of crisis, subsidies granted by distant legislatures, all reached across borders and touched the price of bread in Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, Madrid. Yet again, the clerk at year's end did not record these distant decisions. The ledger did not note the laws passed abroad, the ships loaded in foreign harbors, the quotas set in foreign capitals. It did not describe the policies of allies or rivals. It wrote only the same calm words: wheat, rye, barley, oats. Figures slightly higher or slightly lower, the same rhythm unbroken, the same monotone repeated, smoothing the vast web of international politics into a simple list of values. By the later years of the century and into the present, policies had grown even more intricate, shaped not only by national needs, but by global trade, environmental regulation, subsidies tied to land management, and debates over sustainability. Governments spoke of climate, of soil preservation, of energy and fuel linked to crops. Grain was not just food, but part of a larger network of concern. Yet the ledger, which cares for none of these layers, carried on as always. Wheat was entered at one number, rye at another, barley and oats alongside, the same as in every year before. The full century of politics, of regulation, of intervention and negotiation, is visible only as faint shadows in the movement of those prices. And as one listens to this long story, the detail of government fades into the background, absorbed into the steady hum of numbers that rise and fall but never hurry, never speak, never change their tone. Thus the hand of government, strong though it was, shaping markets, guiding farmers, steadying consumers, vanishes in the telling. For the record we have is not of parliaments and councils, but of ledgers and figures. A century of policy is smoothed into monotony, its sharp debates reduced to quiet changes of price, its arguments and intentions dissolved into the calm repetition of ink on paper: wheat, rye, barley, oats. Year after year, decade after decade, century in its turn, all reduced to the same steady hum. And so, even politics, with all its noise and energy, becomes lulling, flattened into the calm rhythm that carries the listener into quiet rest. When one reaches the end of a century of European grain prices, there is no single figure that defines it, no single moment that stands above the rest, but instead a long chain of years, each one much like the one before, each one reduced in the end to a simple set of numbers. Wheat at this price, rye at that, barley and oats marked in their turn. 100 years pass, wars come and go, economies rise and fall, governments argue and legislate, families live and work and sleep and eat, and yet, in the record that remains, all of it is smoothed into the same monotone. The sharp crises that once felt so urgent are reduced to quiet rises and falls. The generous harvests that once felt abundant are reduced to steadiness on the page. The full weight of living through a century is flattened into the rhythm of prices that shift and settle, rise and fall, over and over again. The story of 100 years is not told as drama, but as repetition, and in that repetition lies the calm, endless hum that carries us to rest. From the early 1920s, when Europe was recovering from the scars of war, through the fragile 30s, the violent 40s, the rebuilding of the 50s, the steadiness of the 60s, the anxieties of the 70s, the restructuring of the 80s, the optimism of the 90s, the adjustments of the 2000s, the turbulence of the 2010s, and the uncertainty of the 2020s. Each period felt different to those who lived it. Each decade had its storms and its calms, its crises and its solutions, its abundance and its want. Yet, when written into the record, they are all the same. Wheat at one figure, rye at another, barley marked, oats noted. Every year adds only another entry, every decade only another stretch of the same pattern. The living of a century was full of change, but the writing of a century is full of sameness. The voices of millions who lived within it are gone, replaced by the silent ink of prices copied carefully into ledgers. Prices that say everything and nothing at the same time. The farmer who sowed fields in spring, who watched skies in summer, who harvested in autumn, who rested in winter, lived the century through weather, through labor, through worry and hope. The baker in the city who bought flour, who baked loaves, who sold to families, lived the century through customers, through coins, through hunger and satisfaction. The family at table, eating bread, porridge, or beer made from grain, lived the century through meals that were plentiful or thin. Yet all of these lives, so full of detail, so immediate in the moment, are erased in the telling we have followed. They are translated into numbers alone, into wheat higher, rye lower, barley steady, oats unchanged. The drama of life becomes the monotony of record, and the monotony of record becomes the calmness of history told without urgency, without emotion, without end. The century is not remembered as it was lived, but as it was written, and what was written is calm, repetitive, and endlessly the same dot. And so, when the century is viewed as a whole, when all 100 years are gathered together and looked at not as individual moments, but as one long line, it becomes clear that the story is not about crisis or abundance, not about governments or wars, not about farmers or bakers, but about repetition itself. 100 times the same cycle, planting, growing, harvesting, selling, recording. 100 times the same crops, wheat, rye, barley, oats. 100 times the same action, a clerk taking a figure and writing it calmly on a page. 100 times the same result, a price that will, with time, lose its meaning and become only part of a larger pattern. The century becomes not a drama to be remembered, but a rhythm to be felt. A hum of prices rising and falling, always moving yet always the same. A rhythm so steady that it lulls the mind and quiets the body. Thus ends the story of 100 years of European grain prices. It is a story with no climax, no revelation, no conclusion, only continuation. The years will go on beyond this telling, as they always have, with wheat sown and harvested, with rye, barley, and oats growing and ripening, with ledgers continuing to record their values, with prices continuing to rise and fall. The story has no true ending, only a pause here, only a moment of stillness before it begins again. For history itself is not a drama, but a repetition, and in this repetition lies calm, and in this calm lies rest, and in this rest the listener may finally close their eyes, hearing only the quiet hum of numbers, a lullaby written not in music but in ink, not in melody but in prices, carried across a century, carrying us now into sleep.